إينا إيمنت كثاوة قديشة بتايلة قديا اختمري موشة لخا البوخ مش ماشنة من قمشيخة ترى البشنة لتن هيش من دي لخا إيمت على بقراية لقاموشة قد كاتو قديا بقرايخ اجي بقرايخ اوريتا يعني عندنا 5 أسفار بقراينا اوريتا بحشوق ولا قديا ايشادات ابسقوبة ديا مالبانا مع اوريتا يعني مناير نهرة إثا يعني بحرة تيلي اتمجد بحرة تيلي.
سفر التكوين الأصحاح الأول. في البدء خلق الله السماوات والأرض، وكانت الأرض خربة وخالية، وعلى وجه الغمر ظلمة، وروح الله يرف على وجه المياه. وقال الله ليكن نور، فكان نور. ورأى الله النور أنه حسن، وفصل الله بين النور والظلمة. ودعا الله النور نهارا، والظلمة دعاها ليلا. وكان مساء وكان صباح يوما واحدا. فعمل الله وحوش الأرض كأجناسها، والبهائم كأجناسها، وجميع دبابات الأرض كأجناسها. ورأى الله ذلك أنه حسن. وقال الله: نعمل الإنسان على صورتنا كشبهنا، فيتسلطون على سمك البحر، وعلى طير السماء، وعلى البهائم، وعلى كل الأرض، وعلى جميع الدبابات التي تدب على الأرض. فخلق الله الإنسان على صورته، على صورة الله خلقه، ذكرا وأنثى خلقهم. فخلق الله الإنسان على صورته، على صورة الله خلقه، ذكرا وأنثى خلقهم. وباركهم الله وقال لهم: أثمروا واكثروا، واملأوا الأرض وأخضعوها، وتسلطوا على سمك البحر، وعلى طير السماء، وعلى كل حيوان يدب على الأرض. سفر التكوين الأصحاح الثاني. فأكملت السماوات والأرض وكل جندها، وفرغ الله في اليوم السابع من عمله الذي عمله، فاستراح في اليوم السابع من جميع عمله الذي عمله. وبارك الله اليوم السابع وقدسه، لأنه فيه استراح من جميع عمله الذي عمل الله خالقا. وجبل الرب الإله آدم ترابا من الأرض، ونفخ في أنفه نسمة حياة، فصار آدم نفسا حية. وغرس الرب الإله جنة في عدن شرقا، ووضع هناك آدم الذي جبله. واسم النهر الثاني جيحون، وهو المحيط بجميع أرض كوش. واسم النهر الثالث حداقل، وهو الجاري شرقي آشور. والنهر الرابع الفرات. وأخذ الرب الإله آدم ووضعه في جنة عدن ليعملها ويحفظها. وأوصى الرب الإله آدم قائلا: من جميع شجر الجنة تأكل أكلا، وأما شجرة معرفة الخير والشر فلا تأكل منها، لأنك يوم تأكل منها موتا تموت. وقال الرب الإله: ليس جيدا أن يكون آدم وحده، فأصنع له معينا نظيره. فأوقع الرب الإله سباتا على آدم فنام. فأخذ واحدة من أضلاعه وملأ مكانها لحما. وبنى الرب الإله الضلع التي أخذها من آدم امرأة، وأحضرها إلى آدم. فقال آدم: هذه الآن عظم من عظامي ولحم من لحمي، هذه تدعى امرأة، لأنها من امرئ أخذت. لذلك يترك الرجل أباه وأمه ويلتصق بامرأته، ويكونان جسدا واحدا. وكان كلاهما عريانين، آدم وامرأته، وهما لا يخجلان.
Humans created by God in the Garden of Eden. All was well until a snake tricked Eve into eating an apple, then Eve tricked Adam, then God kicked them both out, and it turned into a whole thing. Well, here's the real story of Adam and Eve. If you actually read Genesis, you'll notice God creates the universe and everything in it twice, and the two accounts directly contradict each other in some places. If you don't take the creation story literally, as many Christians and Jews don't, then it's not an issue. But it's a huge problem for some biblical scholars who believe Genesis was one story completely written by Moses. Some people in history have gone to great lengths to make the two versions mesh, like when they made Adam a hermaphrodite. In the first version of creation, it says God formed Adam and Eve at the same time, and the story used the phrasing, male and female, he created them. Some early Christian theologians decided this meant that they were made to have both sexes, and while many church leaders were uncomfortable with that idea, it stuck around as a theory for centuries. The two versions of creation are also where the idea of Lilith comes from, and Jewish mythology says she was Adam's first wife. She later became a demon, as usually happens in these stories. Lilith is the woman mentioned in the first creation story, while Eve is the one made later from one of Adam's bones. It's always important to remember that if you're reading the Bible in English, you're reading a translation. This becomes especially vital when you learn things like Eve was created from one of Adam's ribs, because that's not what the original Hebrew word means. Biblical archaeology says the word Selah appears 40 times in the Bible, and the only time it's translated as rib is in reference to Eve. It usually refers to the side of something, so this leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And interpret people have done. A legitimate biblical professor put forward the idea that Eve was in fact made from Adam's baculum, which is a penis bone that's extremely common in mammals. Even other primates have one, and Dr. Ziani Zevit thinks Genesis holds the answer as to why humans are missing it. If God took a bone from Adam, then his descendants presumably wouldn't have that bone. Men have an even number of ribs but are missing the baculum, so it stands to reason, he says, that's the real bone God formed Eve from. It seems like such a minor thing, and it's the question of whether or not Adam and Eve had belly buttons. But it's far from minor, and has been a theological nightmare for millennia. If they had them, then they have the scar of a gestation that never occurred, so why would God put it there? On the other hand, if they didn't have them, how are they perfect representations of humans? The book, Did Adam and Eve Have Navels, details just how big a deal this debate was, and includes a record of a congressional committee getting involved in the debate in 1944 when it objected to a pamphlet given to soldiers that included an image of Adam and Eve with belly buttons. The debate has been a huge problem for artists through the centuries, too. Some just added a few convenient navel-covering leaves, but many left Adam and Eve with completely smooth stomachs. In a bizarre twist, the belly button debate has met the evolution debate. An 1857 book said the fact Adam and Eve had belly buttons proved the Earth was only a few thousand years old. All the seemingly older stuff, like the fossil record, was just the Earth's version of an unused belly button, a past history of the Earth that never existed except in the divine mind. Ask anyone what fruit Adam and Eve ate to make God angry, and they'll tell you it was an apple. But if you actually read the Bible, it doesn't say anything at all about what specific kind of fruit it was. In English translations, it's just the fruit on the tree. Even if in the original language, the Hebrew word is peri, which is equally as vague. According to NPR, peri has been interpreted in different ways by different Jewish scholars, who have identified it as a fig, a grape, a pomegranate, an apricot, or even wheat. Still, others thought of it as an intoxicating drink like wine. So why is everyone so sure it's an apple? Because of a pun. In the 4th century AD, Pope Damasus decided the Bible needed to be translated into Latin. The scholar Jerome was given the job, and when he got to the mention of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he apparently decided to make a pun. In Latin, malus means evil, but it also means apple. So the fruit of the tree that introduced Adam and Eve to evil was an apple. John Milton really cemented the image when he called the forbidden fruit an apple twice in Paradise Lost. In the 1800s, scholars started to understand more about the ancient Egyptian civilization. Texts were being deciphered, monuments were dated, and a lot of the stuff was really old. But it also caused a crisis in religion, forcing people to ask how, if the Bible is literal and Adam and Eve were only created a few thousand years ago, could this Egyptian stuff be older than that? The pre-Adamite theory held the answer. Pre-Adamite is a 17th century idea that simply suggests that there were people alive before Adam. In Genesis, only Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel have been mentioned by the time Cain murders his brother, and the pre-Adamite theory explains where his wife came from, along with all the other cities that suddenly appear. Some Christians also like this idea because it meant some people on Earth were descended from people who weren't Adam and Eve, and it allowed for the argument that those people were not as important. Shocking no one, that idea was used to justify slavery and explain just how some people's lives could be worth more than others. But that's not even clear-cut either. If you go to that country wanting to visit paradise, there are two competing places that both claim to be the real Garden of Eden. There is often an assumption that Christians believe the creation story in Genesis is absolutely literal and that Adam and Eve actually existed.
I've been a preacher for more than 30 years. I've studied and taught through the book of Genesis many times in churches all around the world, and I've trained pastors in the skills of interpreting texts. And it's very clear they're not stories about gods. They're stories about the powerful ones in the Bible and the sky people, the Anunnaki, in the Sumerian tablets.
In 1896, eminent scholar Nathaniel Schmidt was fired from his position as Professor of Semitic Languages at Colgate University. For 11 years, this American university had enjoyed Nathaniel Schmidt's erudition in Semitic languages. He delivered numerous courses in Hebrew, Aramaic, Coptic, Arabic, Syriac, and other ancient languages besides. In fact, Nathaniel Schmidt was one of America's leading scholars in the field. So why, after 11 years of outstanding achievement, was he tried for heresy and fired from his tenure in 1896? Though a devout Christian and a Baptist pastor, the authorities considered that his recent theological papers had struck at the very roots of two world religions, Christianity and Judaism.
What Nathaniel Schmidt had done wrong was read the Sumerian and Babylonian and Assyrian texts and notice that they were full of fascinating parallels, stories that occurred there that were uncannily similar to all the stories of beginnings of the Bible. Stories like Adam and Eve, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, the limiting of human life, the event at the Tower of Babel. And Schmidt's work demonstrated that the Sumerian accounts and those that followed it from nearly 6,000 years ago were in all probability the source of all those familiar biblical stories. Now, that was a problem in the 1890s, because if you think about it, the church was still reeling from the after effects of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and it was busy putting together new doctrinal bases and new doctrines of biblical inerrancy to shore up the ship. So the idea that the Bible might actually be based on somebody else's stories was a bit of an embarrassment. It shouldn't have been, because Judaism and Christianity both find their roots in the story of a Sumerian family. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that in the Bible we have a summary version of all these stories that pepper the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts. The problem and the shock horror is that the original versions, the Sumerian versions of these stories, make no mention of God at all. In the Sumerian originals, these are stories of our ancestors' contact with another species, a species called the Anunnaki.
When looking at demonology and the various figures that appear all throughout religion, there is one female figure, one name more so than any other, that has transcended across numerous cultures, and even to this day still routinely appears as a character in all sorts of popular culture. And that name is Lilith. Some of you may remember in the video discussing the succubus, Lilith was a name that appeared as an early example. The most common description of Lilith, however, is as a demon of the night, seductive and sexual in nature, but also deadly. And if that wasn't enough, she also waits until the cover of darkness to steal babies and young children. This concept can be traced all the way back to ancient Mesopotamian religion, where there once existed a figure known as Lamashtu, the daughter of the sky god Anu. To some, she was an evil goddess, to others a demon, a monster that plagued women during childbirth, one that would steal their children, suck out their blood and marrow, only to gnaw on the bones that remain. The mothers themselves were not safe from Lamashtu, and neither were their unborn children, as she could make women miscarry. As one of the most terrifying demons in Mesopotamian myth, her actions were not just limited to pregnant women. She would drink the blood and eat the flesh of men. She infected one's dreams until only nightmares were left. Wherever she went, she was followed by sickness, disease, and death. With these stories of Lamashtu, we can definitely see a parallel with creatures such as vampires and succubi. Today, many think of Lilith as the first wife of Adam, who rebelled and was later replaced by Eve. This idea stems from the book of Genesis, the very first book in both the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. Genesis 1 details the creation of the universe as well as everything inside of it. It says that God created the heavens, the earth, vegetation, animals, and lastly mankind in his own image to rule over what he had created. What's important to note is that Genesis 1 states that he created both man and woman at the same time. Genesis 2 is very similar, discussing the creation of the universe, but it differs in regards to the creation of man and woman. Here, man was created first. Not wanting his creation to be alone, God sent man into a deep slumber and took from him a rib, which he would use to create the first woman. So essentially you have two contradicting accounts of our creation, one right after the other. To many, the word of God is sacred, and therefore cannot contradict itself. This led to scholars explaining the differences between Genesis 1 and 2 as describing two separate events, rather than two accounts of the same event. This in turn created the need for a story that explained these differences, which would be found in what is referred to as Midrash. The explanation here is that God needed to create woman twice, once with man and then again from man. The woman in the first story isn't identified in Genesis, but would eventually be known as Lilith. The woman in the second story is who we know from the Bible as Eve. So if you've ever heard the story of Eve being created from Adam's rib, that is the story found in Genesis 2. Lilith also appears in the Talmud, and these accounts are far less ambiguous than what we see in Genesis. She appears here a total of 4 times and is never referred to as Adam's wife. Where the Babylonians referred to Lilu as winged male demons, the Talmud speaks of Lilith or Lilitu as a demon with wings and the face of a woman. It says that a man sleeping in a house alone may be seized by Lilith. It's said that she collected the semen of men while they slept in order to create more demon offspring, which again can be seen as one of the earliest examples of the succubus. She is then also associated with several demons, one of these being Agrath, a demon of the night who preys on children and the vulnerable. So far we can see 2 distinct images of Lilith, the woman and the demon. But what happened in this middle ground from when she was created all the way up until she became a demon? Stories explaining this were developed in much more detail around the Middle Ages, so from the 5th century to the 15th. The Tales of Ben Sira and the Alphabet of Sirach are pieces of work that echo a sentiment that many scholars and scribes seem to agree upon. When Adam and Lilith were created, neither one of them wanted to submit to the other. To some, this just meant who assumed the dominant role in the relationship, whereas others took this to mean neither one wanted to assume the bottom position during sex, as it was a sign of subservience. With neither one of them willing to compromise, Lilith then fled the Garden of Eden. Out loud, she then pronounced God's real name, and in doing so she instantly became a winged demon. When the angels pursued her in the hopes of bringing her back, she told them she had no intention of returning. As punishment for her disobedience, the 3 angels who found her promised to kill 100 of her demon children every day. Her purpose now was only to cause illness and sickness to the infants of others. Whenever a child was born, she would claim dominion over that child for 8 days if they were a boy, and 20 if they were a girl. With this there came only one compromise. Whenever she saw the name of any of these 3 angels inscribed on a medallion or an amulet, that child would be left alone. There isn't much surviving material from the Akkadian Empire that allows for an in-depth analysis of Lamashtu or the Lilitu in relation to Lilith. But what we do know from the Babylonians and Sumerians is that all of these creatures were fairly similar, and it's not a huge stretch to say that they may have influenced Lilith's story in some way. The lack of information regarding her origin is made up for by how popular her story was. The Middle Ages mark this period like no other, with numerous tellings and interpretations. Depictions of her varied from a beautiful woman to a more sinister demon, and some even saw her as the snake in the Garden of Eden who tempted Eve with the forbidden fruit, as one final act of revenge. As time went on, there were folktales that saw Lilith as a demon queen, and thus related to Asmodeus, who many consider to be the king of demons. Asmodeus being mentioned in the Book of Tobit, the Talmud, and numerous other scriptures means it's not really a huge surprise that Lilith and he were paired together as the mother and father of demons. Together they had thousands of demon children, and travelled from village to village causing chaos and destruction. In some stories she's also closely linked with Samael, who himself is a rather odd character. Some teachings in the Cabal go as far to say that Lilith was Samael's consort, and that it was not God who created her, but instead Samael who made himself a demon wife, who filled the role later intended for Eve. He also gave her a host of demonic children, one of these being Asmodeus, who we mentioned earlier. Throughout all these stories there are 3 main sides to Lilith. The woman who rebelled against God and Adam, which is the side we see the least of, the seductive demoness who plagued the dreams of men to grow her demonic family, and lastly the monster who preyed upon pregnant women, devouring their children. When I first read about Lilith, I immediately drew some parallels between her and some of the creatures we see in Greek mythology. When you think of an odious and foul-smelling bird-like creature, the harpies certainly come to mind, but so do the sirens, who have a more seductive nature. However, the character who closest resembles and embodies these 3 sides of Lilith is Lamia. These 3 stages are almost mirrored in her story. She begins as a regular woman who falls victim to lust, and as a result her children are killed as a punishment. She's then transformed into a monster. In some tellings, Lamia and the Lamiae are vampiric demons who feed off the blood of young handsome men. Honestly, stories of Lilith are rather confusing. It's only really because of stories from Midrash and other scholars that we can even draw a link between the demon and the wife of Adam. Personally, I think Lilith has an interesting story, regardless of how confusing and stitched together the original references may be. Whether you see it as a fall from grace or a rebellious uprising, it's a very universal concept, which is why I think it's referenced so often today. It may also have something to do with the occult and modern fantasy going hand in hand. Let me know what you think about her story, and whether you noticed how often she appears today.
There's this book called the Bible. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's pretty popular. But as you probably know, there's a lot of different versions of it. Now, the Hebrew Bible is what is perhaps most universally accepted. It is what's known to Christians as the Old Testament and to Jews, or in Hebrew, as the Tanakh. And whereas the New Testament is something added later on by Christians and thus only accepted by Christians, the Old Testament is considered sacred scripture by both Jews and Christians, and the stories that's contained in them also serves as the basis of much of Islam as well. Contrary to what many may believe, the Hebrew Bible is not actually one unified book, but actually a collection of many different books, including the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah, and the prophetic books like Kings and Samuel and Isaiah and Hosea and Habakkuk and all these, as well as the Ketuvim, or writings, While all of these are considered sacred, the most important or exalted of them all is probably the Torah, also known as the 5 books of Moses. And these books include Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the stories contained therein from the very creation and beginning of the universe and the world, and of Adam and Eve, all to Noah and the ark, and Abraham and his family, to Moses bringing his people out of Egypt and receiving the commandments on Mount Sinai, and then the nation of Israel walking the deserts for 40 years, and then eventually all the way up to the very death of Moses himself and his last speech to the people. And when was it authored? This is a very difficult question to answer, and for a number of reasons. According to Jewish tradition, or Abrahamic tradition generally, the Torah was received or revealed to Moses by God on Mount Sinai and then written down by him. But now, from a historical point of view, there's no way to know for sure that this is true. We don't even actually know if Moses existed at all, since we have no real evidence of his existence outside of the Bible itself. However, most biblical scholars today agree that the Torah was not probably written by one person, in this case Moses, but instead written in fragments by a lot of different people over a long period of time. The history of the people of Israel is very uncertain, and we have very little information about its origins. But again, going back to the original question, who wrote it, and how did it assume its current form? Well, to answer the first question, we simply don't know. But there are a lot of theories about the chronology of events. A very popular theory in the 20th century, and still today, even if it is contested by some, is something known as the documentary hypothesis that was proposed by a German scholar, Julius Wellhausen. In this theory, it is argued that the Torah was composed by 4 main sources over a period of hundreds of years. The earliest of these is known as the J source, or Yahwist source. The J stands for Yahweh, or the misunderstood pronunciation Jehovah, which was prominent at the time, and this is a personal name for God. Yahweh, that is. And the text of the J source is characterized, among other things, by the use of this name for God. The second is known as the E source, named after another of God's names, Elohim, and is again characterized by a preference for this name for God. This source is likely written after the J source, and the two were later combined, with J serving as the main part of the text. Thirdly, there is the Deuteronomist source, which scholars think is responsible for basically the entire book of Deuteronomy, as well as some of the books outside the Torah, like Samuel and Kings. This source is characterized by things like absolute morality and a lot of laws and things like that. And lastly, there is the P source, or priestly source, written by priests, and this, sort of logically, is characterized by a focus on purity, issues of purity, and rituals, a lot of rituals. As mentioned, the J and E source probably originates in the time of the first temple in Jerusalem, and their contents thus also reflect this environment in this period. Both the D and the P source, however, are much later developments, probably from the time of the exile in Babylon in the 6th and I think 5th centuries, when the people of Israel were forced out of their homeland. The temple, that is the house of God, was destroyed, and in exile they were forced to sort of forge this new identity. And so these two texts also very much reflect that kind of environment, this new kind of thinking. The exile period is incredibly important for the development of Judaism as we know it. It is here that things like personal prayer and many of the rituals that we associate with Judaism comes about, as a result of the drastic change in environment and by living as a minority group. It is likely that important theological changes were made at this time as well. Much archaeological findings show that in the land of Israel and Judah there were many other gods and idols that were worshipped alongside Yahweh. This has led some historians to argue that the Israelite religion pre-exile wasn't monotheistic in the regular sense of the word, but that they practiced monolatry, or a kind of henotheism, that is, the acceptance and belief in many different gods, but worshipping only one, or considering one to be more exalted than the others. It is thus interesting to see how Judaism seems to evolve gradually from a religion much more similar to those of the other empires at the time that were mostly polytheistic to eventually become something very different, first through a kind of henotheism, and then during the Babylonian exile especially, there's this shift, it seems at least, to a very much more pure monotheism that would then characterize Judaism going forward. From the time after the Babylonian exile, there is no longer any trace of monotheism in this culture, which seems to imply that something very important happened here. There was a very important shift. Now, the Bible itself states that Judaism was always monotheistic and that the people over different periods of time sort of turned away from the true religion, and they thus explain it that way. Whether you believe this version of the story or that of historians, they both seem to agree that the move to a more pure monotheism was the result of a very traumatic experience of exile and the destruction of the temple. So the D, and particularly the priestly source, probably stems from this period, when certain theological ideas and developments within the religion had taken place. And this is also, as I said, reflected in the text. It is also probably around this time that the different fragments and sources were gathered together into one text, or a collection of texts, so to speak. Something that is very interesting is that this supposed shift in authors and time periods can sometimes be clearly seen in the text of the Torah itself. One of the best examples, in my opinion, is in the very opening chapters of Genesis, which describes the creation of the world and the story of Adam and Eve. Scholars believe that Genesis 1, that is the first chapter, stems from the priestly source, and thus a later development, and that most of Genesis 2, the second chapter, comes from the J source, which is much earlier. So let's compare them for a second. If you read Genesis 1, it describes how God creates the world in 6 days and then rests on the seventh. It describes how he creates animals and later humans, and it's all very poetic. But then you move on to the second chapter, and the second chapter opens with this. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. And wait a second, the story seems to start again from the beginning. And the rest of the chapters seems to give a second version of events that sometimes even contradict the first. To begin with, there is a sharp difference between what name is used to refer to God. In the first chapter, God is called exclusively by the name Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God. But suddenly in the second chapter, he is consistently referred to by his other name, Yahweh, or more specifically, the combined name Yahweh Elohim. According to scholars, this is a clear break between the priestly source and the J source. The nature of God also differs somewhat. In the first chapter, God is very much transcendent, and he creates the world by his word. He also creates the animals, and then he creates man. And as for the genders, it says the following. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. However, in the second chapter, God is a lot more human and described in anthropomorphic ways. For example, he formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. He's also described as walking around in the garden, and when the humans hide, he exclaims, "Where are you?" indicating he is not all-seeing. In this version, also, God creates man first, and then only after he creates the animals. And rather than creating man and female at the same time, Eve is created from the rib of Adam to be of service to him. Clearly then, here we have a very clear indication of the documentary hypothesis at work. It seems clear to scholars that these different aspects of the text were different or written by different people at different periods, and thus they reflect the different periods in which they were written. The priestly source emphasizes a more transcendent God, something that was more important in later developments, and also describes things like resting on the seventh day, which is likely a reflection of the ritual of the Sabbath that had developed at that time. Things like this can be found all over the Torah, especially the first 4 books, with very clear stylistic language differences, word uses, and even sometimes contradictory versions of the same story. From the 6th century onwards, these texts became more and more viewed as a single whole, and parts outside the Torah itself was added to the canon as well. It should be remembered that the documentary hypothesis is not in any way universally accepted by all scholars of the Hebrew Bible. Many other theories have appeared over the years, especially in the last few decades. But what all of them seem to agree on is the idea that the Hebrew Bible was written, or the Torah I should say, was written by many different hands and over a time period of many centuries, then developing and evolving and changing according to the new kind of ideas and theological developments that were taking place in the Israelite religion. The very story of Moses and the role that he plays in the religious history and the religious mythology that matters most to Jews, Christians, and Muslims in the world, both historically and.
This book wrote about the mysteries in the Bible, which have remained unsolved for thousands of years. This book says the most mysterious part is Genesis, in which God is referred to as us. The mysterious word in Genesis, us. When God the Father created man, he didn't say, "Let me make man," but he said, "Let us make man." God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." God is one, the Father. So then why is God described as us in the Bible? The mystery about the Creator starts from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Torah, the original text of the Bible, it is written as Elohim, which means gods. It means the Creator is not only God the Father. Elohim means gods as the plural form of El or Eloah, which indicates God in the singular form. In the Bible, God is recorded as gods or Elohim over 2,500 times. This shows there must be another God, not only God the Father. Male and female were created in the image of God. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Man was created in the image of God the Father. Woman was created in the image of God the Mother. Elohim, the Creator, is God the Father and God the Mother. And it is prophesied that God will appear in the last days.
Nearly 700 years ago, it was just common knowledge that Moses wrote the Torah. Everyone studying the Bible knew it. Moses wrote every word of the book, and scribes had passed it down perfectly. Even as far back as the 1st century, Josephus claims in Against Appian that there is no discrepancy in what is written, when referring to the Jewish canon. There were, after all, plenty of places in the Torah in which Moses can be seen writing, and many more places that refer to the book of the law of Moses. Eventually, however, problems began to arise, and this perfect view of a Torah written by Moses would soon fall apart. So today, we will be exploring the claim that Moses wrote the Torah. In Jewish tradition, when the Torah is raised, the phrase, "This is the Torah that Moses set before the people of Israel, by the mouth of God through the hand of Moses," is spoken. The reason for this is a combination of two verses that, together, show that Moses did in fact write the Torah. Deuteronomy 4:44, "This is the law Moses set before the Israelites," and Numbers 9:23, "At the commandment of the Lord they rested in the tents, and at the commandment of the Lord they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord at the commandment of the Lord by the hand of Moses. Of course, not the entire Torah could be from the hand of Moses, though, and even the most fundamentalist believers realize this. The last 8 verses of Deuteronomy 34, which feature the death and burial of Moses, certainly couldn't be from Moses himself, so traditionally, the whole Torah is written by Moses except the last 8 verses. Most rabbis think that the last 8 verses were written by Joshua, the son of Nun, and the successor of Moses. Mosaic authorship is usually defended on the grounds of just a few verses. The book of Exodus explicitly claims Mosaic authorship when God commanded Moses to write the events of Joshua's military encounter with the Amalekites in Exodus 17:14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." In Exodus 24, Moses told the people God's laws, and they shouted, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." We are then told, Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. Just a few verses later, Moses took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They replied saying, "We will do everything the Lord has said." Even outside of Exodus, there are verses supporting the traditional view of Mosaic authorship. According to Deuteronomy 31:9, Moses wrote down this law for the priests. Deuteronomy 31:24 states that Moses finished writing in a book the words of this law from beginning to end. It seems the conclusion is undeniable. The authorial claim of the Torah is that it is from the hand of Moses. Why then do most scholars today not accept Mosaic authorship? Over time, the consensus shifted from Mosaic authorship to the view that the Torah is a composite work written by many authors over many years. Some of the authors took from many sources. The Torah itself even lists some of its sources. For example, Genesis 5:1. This is the scroll of the generations of Adam. The scroll itself may have come from a book of generations, which held the genealogies of the ancestors of Israel. Other genealogies in the Torah may have been copied from this source. There also may have been a scroll containing accounts of the wars as indicated by Numbers 21:14, when Moses introduces a poem. That is why the Book of the Wars of the Lord says, "The journey to where we are now begins in the 11th century, when Isaac ibn Yashush noticed that the list of Edomite kings in Genesis 36 included kings that existed after the life of Moses. This meant Moses would have no way of putting them into his list of Edomite kings. Following this line of thought, Ibn Yashush reasoned that this section could not have been written by Moses, making this a later addition. For example, the Hadad of Genesis 36:35 would be identical to Hadad the Edomite in 1 Kings 11:14, and Mehetabel from Genesis 36:39 would be the sister of Taphanes of 1 Kings 11:19. Moses would have no access to this information. The response was exactly what you'd expect. People mocked him and ignored his very real concern. Ibn Yashush suggested that these verses were put in at a later time, and for this he was called a blunderer. The person who gave him that wonderful nickname would be a founding father in this non-Mosaic authorship view, however. It was Abraham ibn Ezra. He wrote detailed commentaries on the Bible. Abraham ibn Ezra was actually the first one to suggest the death scene of Moses was not written by Moses, and proposed that it was Joshua who authored the text. There was one major problem with Ibn Ezra's view, however. The writing style of the narrative matched the writing style of the verses preceding it, meaning it was written by the same person. Ibn Ezra did see the problems with Mosaic authorship in the traditional view, but told people not to speak on it and keep silent. A later 14th century scholar, Joseph Bonfils, didn't take Ibn Ezra's advice and noted some key passages that posed problems with Mosaic authorship. These were the verses Ibn Ezra suggested people keep silent about. He mentioned 6 verses, but I will only point out 2 of them for the sake of brevity. Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the Rephaites. His bed was decorated with iron and more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. It is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. Deuteronomy 3:11. Here we are told about the bed of King Og. If the author was Moses, he could not have known about Og's bed, since the city would have only been taken during the reign of David, a king who would have lived centuries after the death of Moses. Deuteronomy 1:1 tells us that God spoke to Moses across the Jordan. This implies that the writer wrote from the eastern side of the Jordan, a place Moses was never allowed to go. The verse, then, would have been written by someone in Israel, on the west side of the Jordan, referring to what Moses did on the east side of the Jordan. Evidence against Mosaic authorship kept being piled on until the 17th century. It was only after about 500 years of investigation that people began to accept that the majority of the Torah was not written by Moses. There were many things that simply made Mosaic authorship implausible or impossible. The Jews and Christians still held to the traditional view for a long time, however. It was only in the 19th century that the tables finally turned. Enter Julius Wellhausen. He is known as one of the originators of the documentary hypothesis. He took all the evidence discussed, along with the different names used for God in the Torah, and came up with something very revolutionary. Keep in mind what follows is a brief overview. He noticed that Deuteronomy shared many similar themes and language with the next 6 books that followed, excluding Ruth, the Deuteronomistic history. He also noted that the history seemed to be split in 2. Sometimes the text would say something would last forever and later clarify it as conditional. This led to his thought that there were 2 versions of this history, DTR1 and DTR2, as they were labeled. He also split the authorship of the rest of the Torah into 3 different authors, J, E, and P, a Yahwist, Elohist, and priestly source, none of which, he argued, were written by Moses. This view would be the consensus for the next century, but it has lost a lot of traction over the last few decades. In those decades, there have been many other proposed ideas, many of which are incredibly nuanced. Perhaps I'll make a video in the future delving deeper into the topic, but the validity of the documentary hypothesis is not important to this video. Today, we are only exploring whether or not Moses wrote the Torah. There are many other things that simply make Mosaic authorship impossible. Certain parts of the Torah use words for places and things that are different from other parts. For instance, some stories used Horeb as the name of the mountain where Moses receives the law, while other parts of the story use the name Sinai. Some stories throughout use the name Amorites for the original dwellers of Canaan, while others use the word Canaanites. Moses' father-in-law is named as Jethro in most stories, but in others he is named Ruel. These contradictions and linguistic anomalies aren't all, though. Numbers 34 speaks of the boundaries to be set in the Promised Land. Most of the areas listed are things Moses would not have known about. Of course, this can be thrown away because it was the words God was speaking to Moses, but that's not how history is done. Historians can't access revelatory or miracle claims. From the view of history, Moses could not have known the names of these places. Statements such as, before any king ruled over the Israelites, in Genesis 36:31, implies a time in the writer's mind when kings had ruled over the Israelites, but none ever did in Moses' lifetime. The text says, at that time the Canaanites were in the land, in Genesis 12:6, which implies the author was writing in a time when they weren't there anymore. But the Canaanites were obviously still there when Joshua led his conquest, and that was after the death of Moses. There's a good reason scholars no longer hold to the view that Moses wrote the Torah. After so many centuries of problematic passages being pointed out, and so many centuries of excommunication and mockery, the view finally dropped away from the mainstream. The problems were simply too numerous to keep ignoring. Moses didn't write the Torah. In fact, modern scholars don't even think Moses existed at all. Over the course of a millennium, scholars have went from Moses wrote the entire Torah to Moses probably didn't exist at all. Thanks for watching.